Hello and welcome to Transfermarkt. My name is Stefan Minkowski, he's Manuel Veth, and today we are talking about the latest managerial casualty in the league. That is, of course, Jesse Marsh, who has been relinquished of his duties at Leeds United. And Manu, this guy is fascinating for a number of reasons. It's always interesting when Leeds make a change. They're a big club in England. But Jesse Marsh himself was quite an interesting appointment. You know, you and I both have a studied interest in the Bundesliga. We know what he was like at RB Leipzig before he made the move to Leeds. But before we kind of dive into his backstory and his performances, I guess, at Leeds, why don't we just kind of jump straight into why they decided to sack him just a few weeks before, or a few weeks after the January transfer window?
Yeah, I think you put it quite well in the article that you pushed out right after the sacking, right? Pulling together some of the stats from Transfermarkt, which I think are quite telling. What was it? 8 wins from 32 games, point average of 1.03 per game. Those numbers are quite a lot lower than what Bielsa managed last year, who he of course replaced, right, and then kept Leeds United in the league. But the problem is that from keeping Leeds in the league to trying to develop the team into a more stable position, that didn't really happen. They essentially just exactly where they were 12 months ago, right, on a relegation spot, although with a game in hand. You look at some of the numbers that I pulled out from the Transfermarkt page, and there's things like only 4 wins from 9 leads, right? Only 2 wins from 2 deficits. And what I think was also really, really interesting, and I've seen a few Leeds fans point this out. Well, we don't spend as much as other teams. This is where we are because of the spending, but they're 7 places behind where their expenditures were, Stefan. So, it's not like Leeds United didn't have the backing. And in the end of the day, this is a results-based business. And when results are not coming, then I think, the manager is always the weakest link. And that this is, of course, putting it very simple. But what I also thought was really interesting, after the results against Nottingham Forest on the weekend, seemed to be quite a lot of fan unrest as well. And I know the board always gets very nervous when that sort of thing happens, right? When you lose control over the situation, not just on the field, not just with the players, but also with the surroundings of the club. And as you said, Leeds is quite a big club. It's not a huge city, but it's a really big club in terms of what it means for that community. And I think the moment you see that fan unrest, I think there was not very much else the board could have done in that regard.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think maybe one thing that also maybe adds to all this is the fact that certainly kind of getting this impression over the weekend that Everton may have made a really shrewd appointment in Sean Dyche, who obviously
Yeah.
managed to pick up a result against Arsenal and just so happened to now be level on points with Leeds in 17th place. As you said, Leeds have a game in hand, if I'm not mistaken, but it definitely suggests that one of those teams that would have taken up that position below Leeds, if they've kind of got their act together, then that obviously puts a huge amount of pressure on the club. Yeah, it's really interesting you kind of mentioned the transfer window, and the transfers and the
Yeah.
signings, because aside from what kind of happened on the pitch, one thing that definitely seemed to kind of define Marsh's time at the club off the pitch was the amount of, players that they signed from, not specifically from North America, but players who come from North American nations. I think I'm not mistaken, there's at least 3 US men's national team players in this
Yeah.
squad now. Talk to me a wee bit about, how you think the club performed in the transfer window while Marsh was in charge, and do you think that played any part in whether he didn't do a good enough job and perhaps why he ultimately was sacked?
Yeah, I mean, they did sell Calvin Phillips, right? And they did sell Rafinha to Barcelona. So there was money Rafinha. And so there's money that came in, but they also did spend quite a lot, 145.59 million euros overall throughout this entire season, which is, as I said, places them 10th in the Premier League. So right in the middle of the pack. What's also interesting, and, two of these signings were Americans, Brendan Aronson, and that signing was complete the moment Leeds stayed in the league last year, right? And then, of course, Tyler Adams, who comes in from RB Leipzig and is a player that Jesse Marsch developed all the way back at New York Red Bulls. I actually thought 2 good signings. Then in the winter, Weston McKennie was added on loan initially from Juventus. There's an option to buy that would make him a record signing for Leeds United, just ahead of Brendan Aronson. So 2 of your biggest signings in club history came potentially under Jesse Marsch, right? And they were both Americans. that is very interesting on its own. I think what is the one thing that was mentioned quite a lot in US media, and I think this is a very fair point, is that they spent about 40 million euros on new transfers, and that doesn't include the buy option of Weston McKennie. If that gets triggered, right, that's another 30 million. So we're talking 70 million euros spent just in the winter window, potentially. He only gave him one game, the Nottingham
Mm,
Forest game, which they then lost and that led to unrest. So that, I mean that is a fair point, but you look at all the spending and the decisions that were made and the players that were brought in. Wöber comes in from RB Salzburg, a former Jesse Marsch club, right? So there's Christofsen, who also came in from RB Salzburg, also a former Jesse Marsch player who came in the summer. So Brandon Aronson, of course, he also knew from his time at Salzburg. So there seems to be kind of almost like a creation of a little bit of a clique, and you wonder if that helped the squad composition overall. And then, of course, if you don't have the results, the Premier League is just so very cruel that it doesn't matter whether you spend 40 million euros in one transfer window plus a potential 30 extra from McKennie, right? I think if the results then don't come immediately, you will get sacked. And the problem too for Jesse Marsh is like, yes, okay, Leeds gave him all this money, they gave him all this time to develop the squad, but they only then gave him this one game. But the club will say, well, you had 32 other games in which you only won 8 games, and we don't care about underlining stats, XG, and all these other numbers that potentially speak in your favor. It's a results-based business, and the results have been poor.
yeah, that's really interesting because he did get back into an extended transfer window, but I guess maybe in these
Mm-hmm.
circumstances when the club are quite clearly signing players that he either has a history with or players that he thinks come from his part of the world that he maybe already has a background information on. It's almost like he's making a rod for his own back in the sense that, well, my tenure at the club will either be will make or break on whether these guys live up to the promise that I've obviously used for them. But then, of course, they then sack him so soon after some of these guys only arrived at the club. It would have made far more
Yeah.
sense to me if they decided to, if they really had long-standing concerns about him keeping the club in the Premier League or where they can move forward with him as a head coach. It would have made far more sense to obviously sack him,
Mm-hmm.
at the start of the winter window or
Yeah.
the winter break rather ahead of the World Cup, because we're talking about a run here at Leeds where, as I said in the article, you have to go back 3 months since the last time Leeds picked
Mm-hmm.
up a win under Jesse Marsh. So it's not as if it's been a very sudden demise for him. So, that kind of leads me on to maybe my final question for you, and with regards to his career, as a manager in European football. You and I both covered his time at RB Leipzig and how that kind of short but very kind of
Yeah.
dramatically failed stint, if you shall say, worked out. And it was almost in a very
Mm-hmm.
similar sense to the Leeds one, where he was billed as this kind of perfect candidate to step in. He was he was a Red Bull guy. Things
Yeah.
were going to be great. He was going to be the kind of this very, well dressed, put together replacement for Julian Nagelsmann. He could certainly talk the talk. And that didn't work out. Something
Mm-hmm.
very similar happened at Leeds. Hasn't quite lived up to expectations there either. What do you see next for Jesse Marsh, Manu, going forward? And do you think he'll maybe stay in European football, or do you think he'll have other options on the table?
Yeah, I mean, his career has been really interesting, right? He was in the Red Bull system so very long. First at New York Red Bulls, and I actually covered him at New York Red Bulls, and then he went to RB Salzburg, Red Bull Salzburg, right? And I actually had the chance to interview him at that time too, and covered him quite a bit, where he did bring through quite a lot of very good players. Erling Haaland is one, right? And there was a lot of success at New York Red Bulls and at Salzburg, and then for some odd reason, that sort of football, even though it was the Red Bull football, just didn't work at Leipzig and it didn't work at Leeds. It was very hard for him to translate that success that he had with Salzburg to a bigger league, probably because oftentimes there was a lack of a plan B. That's been the accusation of him, right? That he does lack a plan B. I mean, the question then, of course, is what comes next? Like, are we going to look at these two failed tenures as the end of his club career? Will he go and maybe become the US men's national team coach, which is something that a lot of US, when you go on Twitter today, I know Twitter isn't the real world. It only represents about 6% of the population, right? But the demands of US men's national team fans is quite high that he should now be the manager to take over. I think he would be open to this, to take over the role that's now been departed by Greg Berhalter after a very tumultuous time, right? He is a very, very good people's person. I've dealt with him. Every time I've dealt with him, he's been just very honest, righteous, very nice. He's a very friendly person as well. And I do think he's also he has the underlying numbers that show that he's a good coach. And I think he just needs to go and get into a position now where he can maybe work with some stability. And maybe the national team is exactly where it's at, right? You don't have the pressure of many games. You have 2 years to build towards the World Cup that is hosted by your home country. And then you can try again at a club level. And I think that is in many ways a logical step.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, if you want to keep on top of any news or rumours about Jesse Marsch, or of course who may replace him at Leeds United, do keep on top of all that at the Transfermarkt website. If you're looking for any stats, anything on Leeds' transfers, how much money they spent, how they rank in the Premier League in terms of transfer spending, you can of course see all of that on our Premier League page on the drop-down menu. So if you're a Leeds fan wondering how much the club have spent and where it's all gone, and where it's all gone wrong perhaps, you can of course do that. So as always, thank you for listening and thank you for watching, and we'll be back soon with another video. Until then, thanks very much.